A MonoBehaviour is a C# class that you can inherit from, and it makes it a lot easier to write code for games. A lot of the stuff you don't even have to write yourself, it's just going to be there and you can just use it. MonoBehaviours are added as components to game objects, so if you select a game object, look in the inspector to the right, you'll be able to see if it's got a MonoBehaviour there. You can manually drag and drop a MonoBehaviour onto a game object, and you can do it during runtime as well with GameObject.add component, and you can destroy a MonoBehaviour with Object.destroy. Stay till the end of the video where I bet you I'm going to show you some of the methods that come with a MonoBehaviour that you didn't know about or that you forgot about. Alright, so let's dive in and look at MonoBehaviours and see what type of methods that we can make use out of in our games. I'll enable this lifecycle cube here in the inspector, make sure this game object, it's just a cube with a renderer and a box collider, and I've got this MonoBehaviour script that I've created and I've added it to it, and we can double click on it here to get right into the editor, and we can see the most important thing is here that it says :MonoBehaviour after the class declaration, and that means that we're inheriting from MonoBehaviour, and that comes with a lot of goodies that we can make use in our games. And a few of the first one we're going to go through are these things at the top here, and you don't override these, you actually just write them like you declare a normal method in C#. So private void awake, and we've got private void OnEnable and start, and it's a bit tricky to know exactly what these are called, so you can look at the Unity documentation for MonoBehaviours and you get a really nice condensed list there, and you can actually figure out a lot of the cool functionality that you can get from this. Let's start by just running this and see what happens. And it's not going to do much. This cube exists here, and in the console we can see that awake was called, we see that OnEnable was called, and we see that start was called. And this order is very interesting and very important here. Awake is always called first on a game object. If you got this MonoBehaviour, awake will run, and then OnEnable will run because it was enabled, and then start is run. You might wonder why there are multiple of these things. Why wouldn't it be just enough with awake? And it's because if you've got multiple game objects, then all the awake methods are called on all of those game objects first. When that's finished, all the OnEnable will be called, and when all of those OnEnabled are finished, then all the start will be called. Because sometimes it's important to put stuff and initialize things in awake, because you want to make sure that by the time you get to start, all the game objects in your scene will have run this awake function. It's used, for example, for game managers. If you want to instantiate a central object that's a singleton, and you want to reach that. If that makes no sense, that's perfectly fine. Don't worry about it. Just know that it's pretty good to have this actual additional places to stick it in. And start is the one that Unity usually recommends. It comes predefined in a script because it's so commonly used. But be aware that you've got the awake and OnEnable here to do as well. So if we go back into our little script that we had here, basically it just executes this one for the game object with a MonoBehaviour, it executes this one, and it executes start. And all I did here was just throw some stuff out in the debug log. I've also got a few other ones that are very commonly used here, like update and late update and fixed update, but we're going to be focusing a little bit on this onDisable as well. And when you declare this one in a MonoBehaviour, this onDisable will automatically be executed if you disable either the game object itself that has the MonoBehaviour or the MonoBehaviour itself. And we can actually look here. If I'm running here, and let's just disable this now, I can actually untick this here in the inspector, and you can see that onDisable was executed. And if I enable it again, then OnEnable was executed. And this is a useful place, OnEnable and OnDisable. For example, if you need to subscribe to events that are happening in your game, then you might want to subscribe to them when OnEnable is executed, and when the game object or the MonoBehaviour is disabled, you want to unsubscribe to that event. So OnEnable and OnDisable are very useful here. Even if I disable the entire game object, you can see that OnDisable was called, because it's automatically disabling the whole hierarchy of this game object. If I enable it again, then we've got another entry here that OnEnable was called. All right, so with this lifecycle, I actually put a few more lines of code in here, and we can see in the update method here, that's also a MonoBehaviour method, and this one is called every frame of your game. That means that every frame, whether it's running 60 frames per second, 1 frame per second, because you've got like a super old computer from the late 80s or something, and you've got a super fast computer, runs at like 200, 300, 400 frames per second. Well, this update method here is going to run every single frame. And this one is very commonly used inside when you create a game. And I've created a little code here because one of the most important thing is that you want to read any keyboard input in the update method here, because you might miss it otherwise. If you hit the key here, I'm checking if I've get key down here and see if I'm pressing alphanumeric 1 here on my keyboard. And if I do that, it's going to enable this MonoBehaviour, or it's actually going to toggle it. It's going to, if it's enabled, it's going to disable it. And if it's disabled, it's meant to be re-enabling it. And if I press number 2 on the keyboard here, then it should destroy the whole game object. And we can try this in action now. So I'll press play and we'll say, okay, what happens if I press 1? Okay, OnDisable was called. That means that when I pressed 1, I read it in the update because it runs every frame. It's not going to miss that key press that I just did. And when I clicked it, then it actually disabled this MonoBehaviour. And I wrote the code here. If you remember correctly now, then, well, if I even remember correctly myself, then it should actually toggle it back on when I press it again, because it toggles this to the other state. So if it's disabled, or if enabled is false, then it should put it back to true. But this is not going to work, and I wonder if you know why. If I press 1 again, you say, ooh, okay, it's not updating. Why it's not happening? And it's because this MonoBehaviour is disabled, and when it's disabled like this, then the update loop doesn't run. So it's actually not in here. And that's very important to know. If you disable a MonoBehaviour or the game object, a few of these methods won't execute. So the update, it's very good for performance reasons, and also you just don't want the objects to update unless they really have to. So that's why you cannot toggle it back on in the same way like this. And we can also destroy the whole game object. If I press number 2 here, make sure this on is enabled. I press number 2. And it just destroyed the game object. And instead of destroying the game object, we can actually do this. We can change this to this. That means actually this particular MonoBehaviour. So if I minimize this, I press play again, and we go, okay, here's my lifecycle cube. I'll select it first of all so we can see it. And we see that we've got the MonoBehaviour here. I press number 2, and I've just destroyed the MonoBehaviour. So you can destroy them too if you want to remove a MonoBehaviour from a game object like this. Okay, let's move on to the second one. We've got this update cube. So let's enable this one. And we've got a script on this one. It's called the MonoBehaviours update. That's just the name of it. And if I double click, what's this one doing? First of all, it's inheriting from MonoBehaviour, very important. And then we've just got the update loop of this. Remember, it's called once every frame. And what are we doing in this? Well, we're moving the object forward by 1 unit. Oh no, actually we're not moving it forward, we're moving it right 1 unit per second. So transform.translate means that we're moving it, and we're moving it in the vector3.right direction. And here's very important. You have to multiply it by time.delta time, because we don't really know how many times we're getting into this update loop. It could be, if you're running 60 frames per second, it's 60 times per second. So it's very important to multiply by time.delta time. So we get a little fraction of a second there, so we know how long was it since we were in this function last time. And then input should always be pulled in this one. So make sure if you're going to read keyboard input or button input or anything like that, put it in the update method. And here we go. Okay, if we press space, it's going to reset the position of this transform back to 0. So let's have a look at what this does. Now when I press play, we can see we've got this update cube, and it's moving to the right at 1 unit per second. Okay, and what happened if I press space? It just resets it. So make sure any movement code, or if you rotate or scale an object continuously, that should go in your update loop. And if you read input from your keyboard, that should also go in your update loop. Remember that. All right, so the next one, let's have a look at some of the MonoBehaviour methods that comes with the physics. So let's enable this one called physics cube, and we've got a pretty similar, but I've got a rigid body attached to this one, which is a physics component, and we can have it use gravity so it falls down. Let's look at this script. What do we have here? We've got something called fixed update. So it sounds a little bit similar to update, right? But fixed update is different from update. It runs not every frame, it runs every time the physics engine updates. And that by default runs 100 times per second in Unity. You can change that, but I don't recommend changing it because it's going a little bit quirky if you change it. I don't think it's meant to be changed. So 100 times per second, this physics loop is going to run. And if you run, a game runs at 60 frames per second, well, then you're going to actually have more physics updates per second than you're going to have frames per second or rendered frames. And if your game runs at 200 frames per second, it's actually going to render a lot more frames than it's going to do physics updates. So fixed update is called once per physics update, which runs 100 times per second by default. And what I've done here is I'm adding a force here of physics.gravity, but negative. And then I'm using just a force mode acceleration here. So every fixed update here, I'm applying basically the gravity, but in the other direction. So this cube here should be suspended in midair. And also I have to make sure that I can reach the rigid body. And that's why we've got this serialized field rigid body RB here. That's because I need to drag this reference to the rigid body so I can actually apply the add force to this one. If we look at the game object, we can see I've got this physics cube here. So this is the one we exposed here with the serialized field, and all I did was I dragged this rigid body onto here, so I got a reference to it. If I press play now, you see that not a lot is going to happen. It's just going to stay here suspended in air because gravity is pulling it down, but my script, every physics update, it's applying the force to compensate for the gravity. But if I disable this MonoBehaviour, I'm actually going to take away the force that I'm pulling up, and it's going to start falling down. Any physics manipulations that you do to a game object, if you have a rigid body onto it, any physics code, if you're moving the rigid body, if you're adding force to it, then you should do it in fixed update, not in update. But it's very important not to read keyboard input in here, because you're going to miss them. Sometimes it'll work and sometimes it won't. You will miss some of them in fixed update, so don't put keyboard input in this fixed update. All right, let's move on to the next one. We've got a mouse cube here, so we've got some more cool MonoBehaviour stuff here. If I double click on this one, we can see what have we got here. So we're inheriting from MonoBehaviour, very important. And here we've got void, on mouse enter. We've got on mouse exit and on mouse down. And if you write these in the MonoBehaviour, then if you move your mouse cursor in over a game object that has a collider and the script to it, it's actually going to execute. We're going to log something to the debug log, just saying on mouse enter, and we're going to change the cube color to red. When we move the cursor out away from the object, then we're going to just debug log it so we know that it happened, and we're going to put the material color back to white. Also, if I click on it, so on mouse down, then we're going to spit out into the debug log here that we've clicked on it, and we're going to change the color of the object to a random color. So let's have a look at what happens. We've got this MonoBehaviour that has to be active like this, and I move the mouse in over in my object and it goes red, and we see in the debug log at the bottom there on mouse entered. Nothing happens if I just keep moving the cursor around here onto the object, but if I move it out, then on mouse exit is called, and if I click on it, then we randomly change the color because mouse down was called on it. And there are more on mouse events. You can do on drag and all sorts of things. So imagine you're making a game where you need to click on objects, find hidden objects, open, close doors. Maybe you want to have a crosshair, shoot something and try to figure out what you've clicked on. You want to pick something up. Maybe you want to squash some grapes or slice some fruit, who knows. Then these are already just there for you to use. MonoBehaviour, and then you've got all these on mouse enter, exit, down and up and out and in and whatever. Just make use of those. Pretty cool stuff. All right, so let's move on to the next one, and we're going to have some visibility stuff here. It might be coming into a realm now that you haven't really explored so much with the MonoBehaviours and their methods. Let's have a look at the MonoBehaviour that we've created, and here we've got on became invisible and on became visible. And this one is going to be called automatically when the game object became invisible to a camera. On became visible, the opposite. When any camera in the scene sees this game object, then it's going to be calling this function here. If I press play, okay, we can test this by, let's just manually drag this position of the cube. Let's slide it on the x-axis and then pull it out. And let's see, here we go. We got a log entry here saying that it became invisible to the camera. And if I move it back in, then it became visible to the camera. And invisible and visible. And this is very useful. Sometimes you want to disable like computation heavy calculations on game objects if they disappear out of screen. Especially if you've got a lot of game objects. Imagine you have like hundreds or even thousands or something of little characters or something. Maybe you want to switch off their animations and do whatever else, switch off their audio, disable the whole hierarchy of components or something. One thing to be a little bit careful, or just aware of it anyway, we clear this one. Notice that it actually disappears out of the camera, but it's still not called it until I've dragged it out a little bit further, and I have to go a little bit, and there we go. The reason why that happens is because we've got like things like real-time shadow casting, and we could have reflections and different types of things that is affecting. So the camera needs to make sure that it's actually out of all those type of ranges too before it's not exactly when it's invisible to the camera itself. It's when it can consider, okay, I don't have to consider this object anymore. Let's go to the next one. We've got a reset cube here. So what does this one do? Let's look at the MonoBehaviour. So here we go, reset. This one's not used very often, but it could be really handy, especially if you write stuff for the editor. In edit mode, I haven't pressed played, and I look here, I've got this MonoBehaviour. I can click on this one and I do reset. Then reset was called and the value was 0. And if I take away this MonoBehaviour altogether and I add it again, let's clear this log here and we'll do reset and validate, drag it in, then we can see that reset was called because when you add the component for the first time in editor mode, then it's going to call the reset too. It's good to initialize values and things like that for game objects this way. We also have a different thing here, and I've remmed this one out, or commented it out. If I uncomment this one, we've got one called onValidate that was called. And this is also an editor feature that comes with the MonoBehaviour, and we can see that it was already called here once. And if I change this up value 5 or 6 or 6, 5, 4, then this onValidate is called. Could be useful as well if you want to save stuff to persistently on the fly when you edit stuff. The reason why it wasn't enabled by default here is because it talks a lot. If it's enabled, it's going to be doing it quite a lot when you do any manipulation to this one. All right, so let's move on to some other methods that come with the MonoBehaviours. Let's look at the collision cubes here. So we've got a cube up here. Let's see, this is actually a little hierarchy of game objects. We've got a cube up here with a rigid body and gravity is applying to it. And we've got a MonoBehaviour called MonoBehaviours collision. And on the lower one, it's just a static cube here with a box collider. And let's look first at the script so we know what to expect. So here we got a little bit more code. The first one is we want to just grab a reference. I'll do that through the code here instead of doing it like I did before with the inspector. So we got to declare the rigid body here and we get that component. This is also a feature that comes with MonoBehaviour. Actually through the awake, we know that one already runs when the game object is first instantiated into the scene or when you press play. And we can actually use this MonoBehaviour to get component rigid body. And then we've got a reference to the rigid body from here on. I also want to remember the original position and rotation of this object because I want to be able to reset that. Then we also know what onEnable does, right? Because when the game object is enabled, then I'm going to reset the position and rotation of this object to the original position and rotation. So we can test this a few times. I'm going to set the velocity of the rigid body to 0 and the angular velocity of the rigid body to 0 as well. So we reset the cube back to where it was. And now we come to the MonoBehaviours that this one was really meant to demonstrate. We've got onCollisionEnter and we've got onCollisionExit. And onCollisionEnter actually comes with some useful information here. It brings in this class, which is a collision class. And you can actually get some cool stuff from this one. Things like, you know, where the contacts were made, you know, where in what normal. So if you want to add some sparks or something, when you hit something, maybe like a bullet or something, then you know the contact normal. So you know in which direction you're going to shoot those sparks. And you also got things like relative velocity, so you know how strong the impact was. And when you do onCollisionExit, then we know that the collision is finished. It's moved away. The colliders are no longer contacting with each other. I'm also setting the cube to red here when we've got a CollisionEnter, and on CollisionExit, we're going to color back to white. So let's press play and see what happens. We've got objects falling down and it goes red and then white again. And we can see that onCollisionEnter was called. I got some information here. I got where the collision point in world space was, what the normal direction is straight up. So we've got X, Y, Z here. Y is 1. So the contact normal was straight. I came straight from above here and the reflection sparks, for example, would have been upwards here. And we know the impact velocity here. It was 5.69 vertically that the relative velocity between these bodies were. And since we had things in onEnable and onDisable, then I can just disable and re-enable this one, because when we run onEnable, remember I reset the location and the rotation and the velocity, so we can just use onEnable, onDisable. So onCollisionEnter and exit, very useful. And we also have something similar here, and that's onTrigger, and got a different scene here, or a different hierarchy of a couple of cubes here, and this one's named cube. How evil. Sphere it should be. We've got one difference here, and if I the spear, it's not a spear, it's a sphere. This one, if we look at the collider, I've actually ticked is trigger here. A little subtle thing, but when you click it on is trigger, it's not actually going to collide like a physical object, but it's going to call a trigger function. And maybe we'll start by pressing play on this one. What happens? So we got, comes in, oh, it goes red when it touches that object, and it goes white again. And we see onTriggerEnter was called, and the trigger object is named as sphere, and then we've got onTriggerExit. What's happening? Well, let's select the cube here and double click on this MonoBehaviour, and we see onEnable. We reset the position here to -3 on a little bit to the left, and then in the update we know what that one does. It runs every frame, and this is where we do our translation code. We translate it in the right direction, and remember you have to multiply it by time.delta time, otherwise it'll go too fast or too slow. And then we've got onTriggerEnter, and we don't get a full collision here because we don't have any relative velocity or anything like that, but we can find out what the other collider was. So here we got a reference to the collider, which is named other. That's how I knew what name it was. When we get onTriggerEnter, then it's only called once when you enter the trigger. Change the color to red, and onTriggerExit here, then we know that we've exited this collider and it goes out. Sometimes it's a little bit easy to forget that it has to be a trigger. So the sphere here, remember, trigger. And another little hidden secret here is that if you don't have a rigid body on this object, let's say I take this one away and I press play, this one is a bit sneaky, because then you notice it's not calling the trigger. And this one gets me even to this day a little bit sometimes. You actually have to have a rigid body on one of the objects. And if you want it to be kinematic, you can actually tick this one. That means that it's going to behave like a, not really like a physical cube. It's not going to fall down like with gravity or anything like that. It's like a static rigid body. Just be aware of it, that the triggers will only work if you have a rigid body attached to one of the objects. Let's move on to the last one in this little demo here, and we've got messages cubes. Okay, so what do these do? We've got two cubes. We've got MonoBehaviours message send, and what's this one say? I've got another MonoBehaviour here called MonoBehaviours message receive. All right, let's look at the send one first, and we have OnEnable. So when it's enabled as MonoBehaviour, I'm going to set the position to -3 again, a little bit to the left. On the update, we're going to translate it just like we did before. And on trigger enter, we're going to have the same as before, but here we got something interesting. Okay, other.send message make me red. What does that mean? Okay, it's going to send a message to another MonoBehaviour and execute a function or a method called make me red, if there is one. And if we look at this receiver one, okay, let's look at this one. This one's called cube as well. Should be sphere. Go in here and double click on this one, and here we go, OnEnable. Okay, it's going to set the color to just white, and then here's a function called make me red, and when this one is called, then it's going to change the color to red for this, and it's going to spit out in the log here that we've make me red is being executed. And you can see this is a bit tricky here because it doesn't have any references here. It looks like it's not used anywhere, and this is a little bit of a quirky thing when it comes to the MonoBehaviours. It's a bit tricky to use the built-in C# editor things that just tells you where do I reference this one, because this is magically called through this messaging system. Let's minimize this and press play, and we're going to see here now that when this enters here, it goes red and it says make me red was executed, and then on trigger exit was called, but we didn't actually do anything in that code. So the key thing here is that you can use this messaging, and not only can you send the message to a specific game object, you can actually send it to parents or ancestors in your hierarchy, or to children as well. Another thing you can do with MonoBehaviours is invoke either once with a delay or repeatedly or repeating. So we had this make me red function here, remember? And OnEnable here, let's do this. Invoke, and then we'll do it, and we'll have to do a string make me red. And then how long should we wait? We'll wait 1 second for this one, semicolon there. So here, when this one is enabled now, it's gonna invoke make me red, but it's gonna wait for 1 second to do it. It should go red now before we actually even touch it. Press play, and we go, whoop, yeah, it went red because I invoked it. Another thing we can do here is you can actually invoke it repeating. We'll do invoke repeating, and then we can have, it's going to run first time after 0 seconds, and then it's going to run every 0.5 seconds. So invoke repeating is going to run this function called make me red, and maybe we should rename this one now to make me any color, and we'll randomize here. So random.range 0f to 1f, and then we'll copy this one. We'll do the same for the red channel, for the green channel, and for the blue channel there. Here's a little tricky one too, because if you change the name of this method, well, then this string is not going to work. So it's going to be make me any color, and the compiler won't complain when that happens. So it's a little bit tricky sometimes to know if you're using this method. But now we should have that it's changing the color every half a second to a random color. So that's what invoke repeating does. There we go. It's changing every half a second now. And the reason here why this one didn't work is because we had the send message and it says make me red has no receiver. And it's because we didn't change this string. That's the little tricky part that you get here, because we changed this to any color, any color. And the good thing is that the compiler, or when you run into it, it'll actually throw you the exception, so you actually know that something was wrong, but it is easy to miss those. And if you want to cancel these as well, there's something called cancel invoke, so you can actually cancel this one out at any point. And if you need to cancel an invoke, you can actually do cancel invoke. And if you do this one, it cancels all the invokes, or you can actually cancel a particular one by supplying the string to it as well. All right, so those are some of the useful methods that you get on the fly when you inherit from MonoBehaviour, and you can use for your game. And it's about 60 or 65 of these predefined message ones, and there are other public methods that you can use too. And it's really beneficial when you make a game to make use out of these. It makes writing the code for the game a lot simpler. But there are a few performance implications, but most, especially beginner developers, won't really run into it. But if you have thousands of objects and they all run the update method, they all do different things very heavily, that's called like this all the time, or if you're using a lot of these send messages to different objects, then it could become a little problematic when it comes to performance. For example, in line war, we can have thousands and thousands of different type of units that are moving around. You got bullets flying, you've got different warheads and explosions going on, and it quickly adds up to tens of thousands of update methods. And sometimes you want to call those manually in a tighter loop instead of letting Unity do it. But for the most part, for many games, especially for a lot of indie games, you can get away with this. It makes it so much easier to develop, and it's a real strength and benefit to make use out of these MonoBehaviours and all the cool stuff that it just comes with. If you found this video useful, consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribe if you want to learn some more stuff about game development. And also a huge thank you to my patrons. I couldn't do this one without you. And all the demo projects and tutorial projects that I do like this, I'll stick that onto my tutorial tier on my Patreon. So that's patreon.com/Imphenzia. All right, until next time, have a great one, and I'll see you then. Bye for now.